Polk the Purposeful. Young Hickory, Polk, unlike old Hickory Jackson, was not an impressive figure. Of middle height, 5 foot 8 inches tall, lean, white haired, worn long, gray eyed, and stern faced, he looked he took life seriously and drove himself mercilessly into a premature grave. His burdens were increased by unwillingness to delegate authority. M- uh, Methodical and hardworking, but not brilliant, he was shrewd, narrow minded, conscientious, and persistent. What he went for, he fetched, wrote a contemporary. Purposeful in the highest degree, he developed a positive 4 point program with remarkable success, achieved it completely in less than 4 years. So, with this paragraph, what you want to understand, of course, they're making the comparison to Andrew Jackson. That's what they call him. Young Hickory, however, he's definitely less impressive with his presidency than Andrew Jackson was. However, he was successful in this 4 point program, which we'll discuss. One of Polk's goals was a lower tariff. His Secretary of Treasury, Wispy Robert J. Walker, devised a tariff for revenue bill that reduced the average rates of the tariff of 1842 from 32% to 25%. With the strong support of low tariff Southerners, the Walker tariff bill made its way through Congress, though not without loud complaints from the Clayites, especially New England and the Middle States, who cried that American manufacturing would be ruined. See Table 17.1. But these prophets of doom missed the mark. The Walker tariff of 1846 proved to be an excellent revenue producer, largely because it was followed by boom times and heavy imports. So one thing you want to understand is, of course, remember the northern manufacturers support this tariff, or they are against this reduction of tariff. Um, they're all for tariffs because that's going to help their manufacturing. If the South is not importing goods, that means you're going to be buying northern manufactured goods. However, as you can see in this table right here, or not in this table, as you will see in another table, there is some success within that. The second objective of Polk was the restoration of the independent treasury. Unceremoniously dropped by the Whigs in 1841, pro-bank Whigs in Congress raised a storm of opposition, but victory at last rewarded the president's efforts in 1846. The third and fourth points on Polk's must list were the accusation of California and the settlement of the Oregon dispute. So you're looking at this idea of manifest destiny again, moving westward. Reoccupation of the whole Oregon had been promised by the Northern Democrats in the campaign of 1844, but the Southern Democrats, once they had Texas, rapidly cooled off. Polk, himself a Southerner, had no intention of insisting on the 5440 pledge of his own platform, but feeling bound by the three offers of his predecessors to London, he again proposed a compromise line of 49. The British minister in Washington, on his own initiative, brusquely spurned this olive branch. The next move on the Oregon chessboard was up to Britain. Fortunately for the peace, the ministry began to experience a change of heart. Britain anti-expansionist Little Englanders were now persuaded that the Columbia River was not, after all, the St. Lawrence of the West, and the turbulent American hordes might one day seize the Oregon country. Why fight a hazardous war over the wilderness on behalf of an unpopular monopoly, the Hudson Bay Company, which had furred out much of the area anyhow? So what we're seeing here is, of course, in this paragraph, which I'm pointing at, Polk. He's a Southerner, and a lot of Southerners kind of lost, I guess you could say, motivation for expansion westward, more specifically the Oregon country. However, you're getting some more Northern Democrats that wanted to continue with that expansion. Lucky for Polk, Great Britain kind of is no longer as interested within this territory, the Oregon country that is. Uh, I mean, their investments in the St. Lawrence River, or not the St. Lawrence, the Columbia River, what they believe to be the St. Lawrence of the West, was not as successful as they'd like. And at the same time, they were afraid that as more Americans are moving westward into the Oregon country, they might need to fight a war in the future. Early in 1846, the British hat in hand came around and themselves proposed a line of 49. President Polk, irked by the previous rebuff, threw the decision squarely into the lap of the Senate. The senators speedily accepted the offer and approved the subsequent treaty, despite a few die-hard shouts of 54, 40, or forever. In every foot or not an inch. The fact that the United States was in a mouth deep in the war with Mexico doubtless influenced the Senate's final vote. Satisfaction with the Oregon settlement among Americans was not unanimous. The northwestern states hotbed of manifest destiny and 54-4ism, joined anti-slavery forces in condemning that they regarded as a base betrayal by the South. Why all of Texas, but not all of the Oregon? Because, retorted the expansionist Senator Benton of Missouri, Great Britain is powerful and Mexico is weak. So what you're getting is the Northern Democrats are very angry because they have this idea of manifest destiny, but they felt that manifest destiny, looking at the Democrats, only, I guess you could say, was biased towards the South. When they say the statement, Great Britain is more powerful, Great Britain is powerful, Mexico is weak, is that that one of the things that we need to look at is when it comes down to why all of Texas, but not all of Oregon. The expansionist Senator Benton, Missouri, saying, well, it's specifically because conflict with Great Britain is something that we want to avoid. Mexico is not as strong as Great Britain, right? But you just want to understand that there is criticism of the Democrat Party from northerner expansionists on why not all of Oregon. So Polk, despite all the campaign bluster, got neither 54-40 nor a fight, but he did get something in the long run. Was better. A reasonable compromise without a rifle being raised. So let's go to our questions. What were the 4 parts to Polk's 4-point program? Those were all discussed, so just make sure that you go back in that chapter and take a look at it. Misunderstandings with Mexico. Fairway, California was another way of Polk's. He and other disciples of Manifest Destiny had long coveted its verdant valleys and especially the spacious bay of San Francisco. This splendid harbor was widely regarded as America's future gateway to the Pacific Ocean. So remember, going back to the previous section, this was actually one of Polk's objectives, right? The third and fourth Polk was accusation of California and the settlement of the Oregon dispute, right? The population in California in 1845 was curiously mixed. It was consistent of perhaps 13,000 something less Spanish Mexicans and as many as 75,000 dispirited Indians. There were fewer than 1,000 foreigners, mostly Americans, some of whom had left their consciences behind them as they rounded Cape Horn. Given time, these transplanted Yankees might yet bring California into the Union by playing the Texas game. So that means that as a result of this many Yankees, which are Northern Americans, more specifically from New England area, what they're saying is if there's enough of them that move, they might go ahead and influence annexation, just like what happened with Texas. Polk was eager to buy California from Mexico, but relations with Mexico City were dangerously embittered. Among other friction points, the United States had claims against Mexicans for some $3 million damages to American citizens and their property. The revolution riddled regime in Mexico had formally agreed to assume most of this debt, but had been forced to default on its payments. A more serious bone was contention with Texas. The Mexican government, after threatening war if the United States should acquire the Lone Star Republic, had recalled its minister from Washington following annexation. Diplomatic revelations were completely severed. So one thing you want to understand here is obviously as a result of us annexing Texas, any diplomatic relations with Mexico, now they're completely gone. Deadlock with Mexico over Texas was further tightened by question of boundaries. During the long era of Spanish-Mexican occupation, the southern western boundary of Texas had been the Nueces River, but the expansive Texans on rather far-fetched grounds were claiming that more suddenly the Rio Grande instead. Polk, for his part, felt a strong moral obligation to defend Texas in his claim once it was annexed. So one thing you want to understand is something that Polk would have to deal with is looking at Texas's borders. Obviously, Texas, before being annexed, they gained their independence from Mexico, and there's a border dispute on what those proper borders are. Polk says he will agree to defend whatever Texas' claim is. The Mexicans far less concerned about this boundary quibble than was the United States. In their eyes, all of Texas were still theirs. Although temporary and revolt and dispute over the two rivers seemed pointless, yet Polk was careful to keep American troops out of virtually all the explosive no man's land between Nueces and the Rio Grande River, as long as there was any real prospect of peaceful adjustment. The Golden Prize of California continued to cause Polk much anxiety. Disquieting rumors, now known to have been ill-founded, were circulating that Britain was about to buy or seize California. a grab that Americans could not tolerate under the Monroe Doctrine. In a last desperate throw of the dice, Polk dispatched John Slidell to Mexico City as a minister in late 1845. The new envoy, among other alternatives, was instructed to offer a maximum of $25 million for California and territory to the east. But the proud Mexican people would not even permit Slidell to present his insulting proposition. So as a result, obviously, in this paragraph, what you want to understand is Polk he feels threatened that the British are going to buy California, so he sends a minister, John Slidell, to go ahead and negotiate with Mexico. But Mexico, obviously unhappy with our annexation of Texas, does not even let Slidell present his proposition. Okay. So you should have been able right here to answer these two questions regarding Polk was eager to buy California, but the relation of Mexico was dangerously embittered. What were the three sources that strained Mexico relation in U.S. and Mexico relation? So make sure that you know those three reasons. Obviously, you want to make sure that you mention the annexation of Texas being one of them. Who was John Slidell and what role did he play in the negotiations for Mexico? He was, of course, you want to make sure that you focus on California in your response to that. All right, American blood and American soil. Right, moving on. A frustrated Polk was now prepared to force a showdown. On January 13, 1846, he ordered 4,000 men under General Zachary Taylor to march from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande River, provocatively near the Mexican forces. Polk's presidential diary reveals that he expected at any moment to hear of a clash. When none occurred after an anxious wait, he informed his cabinet on May 9, 1846, that he proposed to ask Congress to declare war on the basis of unclaimed claims and Slidell's rejection. There, at best, were flimsy pretexts. The two cabinet members spoke up and said they would feel better satisfied if Mexico troops should fire first. So Polk has went ahead and he sent his forces um, to Texas, and he is expecting Mexico to fire, but there is no fire. He wants to declare war, but of course, at this point, what Congress decides is that it would be better for him to just to wait for Mexico to fire. That very evening, if fate would have it, news of bloodshed arrived. On April 25, 1846, Mexican troops had crossed the Rio Grande and attacked General Taylor's command, with the loss of 16 Americans killed or wounded. Polk, further aroused, sent a vigorous message to Congress. He declared that despite all of our efforts to avoid a clash, hostilities had been forced upon the country by shedding of American blood upon American soil. A patriotic Congress overwhelmingly voted for war, and enthusiastic volunteers cried, "Hope for the halls of the Montezumas," and Mexico or death. Inflamed by the war, fever, and anti-slavery Whig bastions melted and joined with the rest of the nation, though they later condemned Jimmy Polk's war. As James Russell Lowell, Massachusetts, lamented, Massachusetts, God forgive her, she and kneeling with the rest. In his message to Congress, Polk was making history, not writing it. Like many presidents with ambitious foreign policy goals, he felt justified in bending the truth if it was what it took to bend a reluctant public toward the war. If he had been a historian, Polk would have explained that American bloodshed had been on soil the Mexicans had good reason to regard as their own. A gangly rough-featured Whig congressman from Illinois, one Abraham Lincoln, introduced resolutions that requested information to the precise spot on American soil where American bloodshed had been shed. He pushed his spot resolutions with such persistence that it came to be known as Spotty Lincoln, who would die of spotted fever. The more extreme anti-slavery agitators of the North, many of them Whigs, brand the president a liar. Polk the mendacious. So one thing you want to understand here that's going on is, or remember that Zachary Taylor, he wanted to just go ahead and Polk wanted to go ahead and declare war, but Congress said that they prefer Mexico fire first. Well, according to these last two paragraphs, Zachary Taylor claims that Mexico did fire and that 16 men were killed. However, there is no actual evidence that Mexico did fire first, and that's what we mean by the spot resolutions. Abraham Lincoln is asking President Polk to declare where this happened, right? Because there's belief that he had made this up just for public policy or for just to gain public approval to go to war with Mexico. Did Polk provoke war? California was an imperative point in his program, and Mexico would not sell it at any price. The only way to get this use of force or wait for an internal American revolt. Yet delay seemed dangerous, for the claws of the British lied by snatched the ripening California fruit from the talons of the American eagle. Grievances against Mexico were annoying and tolerable. In later years, America endured even worse ones. But in 1846, patience had ceased to be virtue. As far as Polk was concerned, bent on grasping California by fair means or foul, he pushed quarrel to a bloody showdown. Both sides, in fact, were spoiling for a fight. Feisty Americans, especially southwestern expansionists, were eager to teach the Mexicans a lesson. The Mexicans, in turn, were burning to humiliate the bullies of the North, possessing a considerable standing army, heavily overstaffed with generals. They boasted of invading the United States, freeing the black slaves, and lassoing whole regiments of Americans. They were hoping that the quarrel with Great Britain over Oregon would blossom to full dress war, as it came near doing, and further pin down the hated Yankees. A conquest of Mexico's vast and arid expanses seemed fanatic, especially in view of the bungling American invasion of Canada in 1812. Both sides fired by moral indignation. The Mexican people could fight with a flaming sword of righteousness, for had no insult the Yankee picked the fight by polluting the soil. Many earnest Americans, on the other hand, still believed that Mexico was the aggressor. So obviously you're looking at this Mexico feels as if that Texas territory is rightfully theirs. However, many Americans, on the other hand, believe that this war, that they were the ones, that Mexico was the one that fired first. The mastering of Mexico. Polk wanted California, not war. But when war came, he hoped to find an unlimited scale and then pull out when he captured the prize. The dethroned Mexico dictator Santa Anna, then exiled with his teenage bride in Cuba, let it be known that if the American blockading squadron would permit him to slip into Mexico, he would sell out his country. Incredibly, Polk agreed to this discreditable intrigue. The double-crossing Santa Anna, once he returned to Mexico, proceeded to rally his countrymen to a desperate defense of their soil. American operation in southwestern California was completely successful. In 1846, Stephen W. Kearny led a detachment of 1,700 troops over the famous Santa Fe Trail from Fort Leavenworth to Santa Fe. The sun-baked outpost with its drowsy plazas was easily captured. But before Kearny could reach California, the fertile provinces won. When war broke out, Captain John C. Fremont, the dashing explorer, just happened to be there with several dozen well-armed men. In helping to overthrow Mexican rule in 1846, he collaborated with American naval officers, with the local Americans who had hoisted the banner of the short-lived California Bear Flag Republic. General Zachary Taylor, meanwhile, had been spearheading the main thrust, known as Old Rough and Ready. Because of his iron constitution and incredibly unsoldierly appearance, he sometimes wore a Mexican straw hat and fought his way around the Rio Grande, Mexico. After several gratifying victories, he reached Buena Vista. There, on February 22 and 23, 1847, his weakened force of 5,000 men were attacked by some 25,000 march-weary troops under Santa Anna. The Mexicans were finally repulsed with extreme difficulty, and overnight Zachary Taylor became the hero of Buena Vista. One Kentuckian was heard to say that old Zach would be elected president in 1848 by spontaneous combustion, foreshadowing what would happen. Sound American strategy now called for a crushing blow into enemies' vitals in Mexico City. General Taylor, though a good leader of modest-sized forces, could not win decisively in the semi-deserts of North Mexico. The command of the main expedition, which pushed inland from the coastal city of Veracruz early in 1847, was entrusted to General Winfield Scott, a handsome giant of a man. Scott had emerged as a hero from the War of 1812, and later earned the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers because of his resplendent uniforms and strict discipline. He was severely handicapped in the Mexican campaign by an inadequate number of troops, by expiring enlistments, by a more numerous enemy, by mountainous terrain, by disease and political backbiting at home. Yet he succeeded in battling his way out to Mexico City, And by September 1847, in one of the most brilliant campaigns in American um, annals, he proved to be the most distinguished general produced by his country between the Revolution and the Civil War. So obviously, this whole section kind of just discusses the victories that we had in terms of in the war with Mexico. Fighting Mexico for peace. Okay. So let's go back to those previous questions. There was just one. And there's a lot of military history here. Obviously, Zachary Taylor, this is important because it's going to lead him up to the presidency later on. Okay. These two last sections are probably one of the most important ones. Military history is important, but the treaties, I would say, are even more important. Okay. Fighting peace for Mexico. Polk was anxious to end the shooting as soon as he could, secure his territorial goals. Accordingly, he sent along with Scott's invading army the chief clerk of the State Department, Nicholas P. Trist, who, among other weakness, was afflicted with an overfluid pen. Trist and Scott arranged for an armistice with Santa Anna at the cost of $10,000. The woolly dictator pocketed the bribe and then used the time to bolster his defenses. Negotiating a treaty with the sword in one hand and the pen in the other was ticklish business. Polk, disgusted with his blundering envoy, abruptly recalled Trist. The worldly diplomat then dashed off a 65-page letter explaining why he was not coming home. The president was furious, but Trist, grasping a fleeting opportunity to negotiate, signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848, and forwarded to Washington. So first, Trist seemed as if he had failed, as Santa Anna had pocketed the armistice money, right? And then he continued to build up his defense. But Polk isn't happy about this. He's telling Trist, hey, head back to Washington. But Trist refuses, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, which you need to make sure you know. The terms of the treaty were breathtaking. They confirmed the American title to Texas and yielded enormous areas stretching westward to Oregon and the ocean embracing coveted California. This total expense, including Texas, was about one half of Mexico. The United States agreed to pay $15 million for the land and assumed the claims of its citizens against Mexico in the amount of $3.25 million. So all in all, what you understand is that America had went ahead and obtained um, just an abundance of territory, more specifically California, and Mexico would have to go ahead and respect that Texas was annexed. And the one thing too is in return would just be the $15 in payment as well as claims to about $3.25 million. Upon the loftiest rungs perched the Californios, pioneers in the Mexico heartland and New Spain, they had trailed Serra to California, claiming land and civil offices in their new home. Yet even the proud Californios had deferred to the all-powerful Franciscan missionaries until Mexico threw off the Spanish colonial yoke in 1821, whereupon the infant Mexican government turned an anxious eye towards its frontier outpost. Mexico now emptied its jails, sent settlers to the sparsely populated north, built and garrisoned fortresses, and most important, transferred authority from one missions to secular authorities. This secularization program attacked and eroded immense power of the missions um, and of their Franciscan masters. With their bawling herds of cattle, the base Indian workers, millions of acres of land, and lucrative foreign trade. The frock friars had commanded the fiefdoms so confidently that earlier reform efforts had dared to go no further than levying paltry tax on emissions and politely requesting that their missionaries limit their floggings to Indians to 15 lashes per week. By the 1830s, the power of the missions weakened, and much of their land and their assets was confiscated by the Californios. Vast ranchos or ranches formed, from whereby citadels the Californios ruled in their turn until the Mexican War. Okay. The California's glory faded in the wake of American victory. Even though in some isolated places they clung to their political offices for a decade or two, overwhelmed by the inrush of Anglo gold diggers, some 87,000 after the discovery of Sutter's Mill in 1848, and undone by the wanting of the pastoral economy. The Californios saw their recently acquired lands and the recently established political power slip through their fingers. When Civil War broke out in 1861, so harshly did the word Yankee ring in the ears that many Californians supported the South. By the 1840s, the Californios brief ascendancy, and utterly vanished a short and sad tale of riches to rags in the face of the Anglo onslaught. Half a century later, in 1910, hundreds of thousands of young Mexicans would flock into California and Southwest. They would enter a region liberally endowed with Spanish architecture and artifacts, bearing the names of Spanish missions in California and Californio Nino ranchos. But they found what they would find in a land dominated by Anglos, a place far different from what California ancestors had been so peaceful in earlier days. Polk submitted to the treaty. So overall, I mean, I kind of read this section to you here. What this is kind of just talking about is um, just in terms of who the rancheros were, the ranchers were, and as well as the fading religious identity that was going on with the missionaries. So let's get back to Polk. Polk submitted to the treaties. Polk submitted the treaty. So the Treaty of Hidalgo of um, Guadalupe Hidalgo is one that you want to make sure you understand for this section. It's probably the most important thing in this section in regards to the AP exam. Polk submitted the treaty to the Senate. Although Tris had proved highly annoying, he had generally followed his original instructions, and speed was imperative. The anti-slavery Whigs in Congress, dubbed Mexican Whigs or conscious Whigs, were denouncing this damnable war with increasing heat. Having secured control of the House in 1847, they were threatened to vote down the supplies of the armies in the field. If they had done so, Scott probably would have been forced to retreat, and the fruits of victory might have been tossed away. So Polk needs to get this treaty through the Senate simply because the Whigs have control of the House, and what their concern is that, hey, this is an issue specifically because eventually the Whigs are looking to limit the resources the army is getting, so this war would end. So he's got to get this treaty through. Another peril impended. A swelling group of expansionists, intoxicated by manifest destiny, was clamoring for all of Mexico. If America had seized it, the nation would have been saddled with an expensive, vexatious policing problem. Far-seeing Southerners like Calhoun, alarmed by the mounting anger of anti-slavery agitators, realized that the South would not do well to be too greedy. The treaty was finally approved by Senate 38-14. Oddly enough, it was condemned by both those opponents who wanted all of Mexico and by opponents of who wanted none of it. So one thing you understand is overall the treaty does pass, but there's criticism with it, both with the Whigs, but as well as Southern expansionists. Some Southern expansionists wanted to be greedy and actually annex all of Mexico. Victors rarely play an indemnity, especially after a costly conflict has been forced on them. Yet Polk, who had planned to offer $25 million before fighting the war, arranged to pay $18.25 after winning it. Cynics had been charged that Americans were wicked by guilty consciences, apologists, and appointed proudly to the Anglo-Saxon spirit of fair play. The decisive factor was the need for haste. While there was still a responsible Mexican government to carry out the treaty, and before political foes in the United States, notably the anti-slavery zealots, sabotaged Polk's expansionist program. So, as stated, the main important thing that you need to know is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So, you want to make sure that you address the terms of that treaty, right? And as well as what were the arguments made against it. So, why were, as stated, why were some of the Northerners, the Whigs, against it, but as well as some of the selfish Southern expansionists, right? Because some of them were greedy, and you need to explain why. All right. In the last section, discuss profit and loss in Mexico. Profits and loss in Mexico. As war goes, the Mexican War was a small one. It cost some 13,000 American lives, most of them taken by disease, but the fruits of fighting were enormous. America's total expense, already vast, was increased by about one-third, an addition even greater than that of Louisiana Purchase. A short stimulus was given to the spirit of manifest destiny. As a proverb has it, the appetite comes with eating. The Mexican War proved to be the blood-spattered schoolroom of the Civil War. The campaigns provided priceless field experience for most of the officers destined to become leading generals in the forthcoming conflict, including Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, although you could say he was useless as a president. No, that was mean. The military academy at West Point, founded in 1802, fully justified its existence through the well-trained officers. Useful also was a navy, which did valuable work in throwing crippling blockade around Mexican ports. A new academy in Annapolis had been established by Navy Secretary and historian George Bancroft in 1845. The Marine Corps, in existence since 1798, won new laurels, and to this day sings its stirring hymns about the halls of Montezuma. So overall, one of the things that you understand this paragraph just said was it was a schoolroom for the Civil War, meaning that many of the important leaders of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant, obtained their experience. The Army waged war without defeat and without major blunder. Despite formidable obstacles and a half dozen or so achingly long marches, Charger and British critics, as well as other foreign skeptics, reluctantly revised upward their estimate of Yankee military prowess. Opposing armies, moreover, emerged with increased respect for each other. The Mexicans, though poorly led, fought heroically at Chapultepec near Mexico City. The Th lads in military academy, therefore Los Niños, perished to a boy. Long memorized Mexicans have never forgotten their northern enemy tore away about half of their country. The argument they had was that they were lucky to not lose all of it. That they had been paid something for the land. That has scarcely lessened their bitterness. The war also marked an ugly turning point in relations between the United States and Latin America as a whole. There too, Uncle Sam had been regarded as some complacency, even friendliness. Henceforth, he was increasingly feared as the Colossus of the North. Suspicious neighbors to the south condemned him as greedy, untrustworthy, bully, who might next despoil them of their soil. So overall, one thing you want to understand is, Mexico lost close to half their territory as a result of this war. And this is going to ruin our relationship, the United States relationship with many of the Latin American countries. They see Uncle Sam as this figure to fear. And remember, what's ironic about this, through the Monroe Doctrine, right? It's the United States was kind of just saying that the American or that North and South America should be given the freedom to rule on their own, but yet South America, or I guess you could say Latin America, is kind of just perceiving the Americans as the Colossus of the North, right? As someone that might bully them in the future, take away their soil. Most announced of all, the war aroused the snarling dog of the slavery issue, all right? And this is one thing you want to make sure you understand. And the beast did stop yelping until drowned in the blood of the Civil War. Abolitionists assailed the Mexican conflict as provoked by the Southern slaveocracy for its own evil purposes. As James Russell Lowell and Cia Bigelow drawl in the Yankee dialect, they just want this California. So's to lug new slave states, and to abuse ye and ya to scorn ye, and plunder ye like ye sin. In line with Lowell's charge, the bulk of American volunteers were admittedly from the South and Southwest. But in the case of the Texas Revolution, the basic explanation was proximity rather than conspiracy. Quarreling over slavery extension also erupted on the floors of Congress. In 1846, shortly after the shooting started, Polk had requested an appropriation of $2 million, which to buy peace. Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, fearful of Southern slaveocracy, introduced a faithful amendment. It stipulated that slavery should never exist in any territory to be wrested from Mexico. The fiercely contested Wilmot Amendment twice passed the House, but not the Senate. Southern members, unwillingly to be robbed of prospective slave states, fought the restriction tooth and nail. Anti-slavery men in the Congress and out battled no less brilliantly for the exclusion of slaves. The Wilmot Proviso never became federal law because it eventually endorsed by the legislature of all but one of the free states. When it came to civilized burning issue of slavery in the territories, it was this issue of slavery's extension into newly acquired lands in the West, more than any other, that drove the broadest and hottest wedge in North and South. So what do you understand about this Wilmot Proviso? It never became a federal law. However, it was something that was debated in Congress that stated that all this newly acquired territory should not have slavery in it. Seen in a historical perspective, the opening shots of the Mexican War were opening shots of the Civil War. Very powerful statement. So you understand this Wilmot Proviso kind of just goes over this idea of sectionalism, right? And now we have all this new territory. What's going to happen to it? Will it be a free state? Will it be a slave state? And the Wilmot Proviso Um, that's the proposal is something that you want to understand. That it's this debate on what's going to happen with these states. Should they be slave or free? And of course, this is advocating that they become all free. See, in historical perspective, the opening shots of the Mexican were the opening shots of the Civil War. President Polk left the nation, the splendid physical heritage of California and the Southwest, also the morally heritage of a toxic slavery dispute. Mexico will poison us, said the philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. Even the great champion of the South, John C. Calhoun, had prophetically warned that Mexico is us the forbidden fruit, and the penalty of eating it would be subject to our institutions to political death. Mexicans could later take some satisfaction in knowing in the territory wrenched from them by sword and musket proved to be a venomous apple of discord that could well be called Santa Anna's revenge. So overall, what you understand is they're referring to the Mexican War as the evil fruit, specifically because we're getting this territory, and it's going to be the start of what we would call the Civil War, right? Or a rising tension. And remember, we've already seen this in the Missouri Compromise, but now this tension is at a complete higher level, right? So what was a Wilmot Proviso, and what was the impact of it? I mean, it was an amendment that was put into Congress and never became a federal law that all the newly acquired states be free states, right? And the impact was long term, it's going to lead to the Civil War because it's increasing sectionalism. If you don't know what sectionalism means that policy, more specifically the issue of slavery, is that people are advocating for or against slavery based on where they live, the North or the South.